Let's get real about something that's going to disappoint people looking for simple solutions. Insulin resistance is complex, multifactorial, and meal timing alone is rarely sufficient to reverse it. I see people adopting intermittent fasting thinking it's the key to fixing their metabolic dysfunction, and while it can be part of the solution, it's usually not enough by itself. Understanding why requires looking at all the factors that drive and maintain insulin resistance beyond just when you eat. Excess visceral fat, the fat stored around your organs, is probably the biggest driver of insulin resistance for most people. This fat is metabolically active, secreting inflammatory chemicals called adipokines that interfere with insulin signaling throughout your body. Your muscle and liver cells become resistant to insulin signals because of this chronic inflammatory state. Now, intermittent fasting might help you lose weight, including visceral fat, but only if it creates a calorie deficit. If you're compressing the same excess calories into a shorter eating window, that visceral fat isn't going anywhere, and neither is your insulin resistance. Sleep deprivation is an independent driver of insulin resistance that people constantly overlook. Even one night of poor sleep measurably impairs glucose tolerance and insulin sensitivity the next day. Chronic sleep restriction, which affects a huge portion of modern populations, creates a metabolic state similar to prediabetes regardless of diet. If you're doing perfect intermittent fasting but sleeping 5 hours a night, your insulin resistance isn't going to improve meaningfully. Your body needs adequate sleep to maintain insulin sensitivity, and no amount of meal timing optimization compensates for insufficient rest. Sedentary behavior independently promotes insulin resistance even in people at normal weights. Muscle is the primary site for glucose disposal after meals. When muscles aren't regularly contracting through physical activity, they become less sensitive to insulin and less efficient at taking up glucose. Strength training specifically has powerful effects on insulin sensitivity because it increases muscle mass, improves mitochondrial function, and enhances glucose transporter expression. Aerobic exercise has benefits too, improving cardiovascular fitness and metabolic flexibility. Intermittent fasting without exercise leaves a huge tool unused. Chronic stress and elevated cortisol are metabolic saboteurs. Cortisol raises blood glucose, promotes fat storage especially around the midsection, and impairs insulin action. Psychological stress from work, relationships, finances, or even from overly restrictive dietary rules creates a hormonal environment that fights against metabolic improvement. Ironically, if your intermittent fasting protocol is causing significant stress because you're constantly hungry, thinking about food, or anxious about eating windows, the cortisol elevation might be counteracting any metabolic benefits. Systemic inflammation from various sources keeps insulin resistance entrenched. Poor gut health and intestinal permeability can contribute. Chronic low-grade infections or autoimmune conditions create inflammatory states. High consumption of inflammatory foods like refined sugars, trans fats, and processed meats maintains inflammation regardless of eating timing. Some people need to address underlying inflammatory conditions before diet changes can effectively improve insulin sensitivity. Here's where combination approaches show their power. Research on reversing insulin resistance typically shows that combining dietary changes with exercise produces superior results compared to diet alone. Adding strength training to modest calorie restriction dramatically improves insulin sensitivity beyond what either intervention achieves alone. Improving sleep alongside dietary changes amplifies benefits. Managing stress through meditation, yoga, or therapy enhances metabolic improvements. The mechanisms are synergistic, not simply additive. Medication can play a legitimate role too. Metformin, the most commonly prescribed diabetes drug, improves insulin sensitivity through mechanisms independent of diet or exercise. For people with significant insulin resistance or prediabetes, combining lifestyle interventions with metformin often produces faster and more complete improvement than lifestyle alone. There's no shame in pharmaceutical assistance. The goal is metabolic health, not proving you can do everything through willpower and dietary manipulation. Time frames matter enormously. Reversing significant insulin resistance typically takes months of sustained intervention, not weeks. Hemoglobin A1C, which reflects average blood glucose over 3 months, is a better marker for tracking improvement than daily glucose readings. Fasting insulin levels and HOMA-IR calculations provide insight into insulin resistance that weight or even A1C might miss. Regular monitoring helps you know whether your interventions are working and whether adjustments are needed. Here's my evidence-based recommendation for addressing insulin resistance. Yes, consider intermittent fasting if it helps you maintain a calorie deficit and fits your lifestyle, but don't rely on it exclusively. Combine it with calorie reduction if you have excess weight. Emphasize whole foods, especially vegetables, and adequate protein. Incorporate both strength training and aerobic exercise regularly. Prioritize 7 to 9 hours of sleep nightly. Develop stress management practices. Consider targeted supplements like magnesium if deficient. Work with a healthcare provider to monitor markers and possibly add medication if needed. This comprehensive approach addresses insulin resistance through multiple mechanisms simultaneously rather than hoping meal timing alone will fix a complex metabolic problem. The disappointing truth that diet book authors don't want you to know is that there are no quick fixes or single interventions that reverse insulin resistance for most people. It requires sustained commitment to multiple lifestyle factors and sometimes medical support. Intermittent fasting can absolutely be part of your toolkit, but thinking it's sufficient by itself sets you up for disappointment when your metabolic markers don't improve as much as you hoped.